After the unexpected death of Alexander the Great, the era of the so-called Wars of the Diadochi began. As monumental as Alexander's achievements had been, so fierce and brutal was the struggle for his legacy. In this 40-year conflict, the king's former bodyguard Seleucus proved to be one of the most fortunate. At the initial division of the empire, he was not granted a single parcel of land, and in essence, Seleucus had to start from scratch, reconquering vast territories. And yet he emerged as the most successful of the diadochi, ruling a kingdom that stretched from the Aegean Sea to India. At first, Seleucus became commander of the hetairoi, or cavalry guard, in the army of Regent Perdiccas. But Perdiccas was killed by his own soldiers during a campaign in Egypt, and Seleucus, being one of Perdiccas's closest associates, may well have played a role in his assassination. After the second division of the empire, he became satrap of Babylonia and brought the lands to the east under his control. This was achieved with relative ease, since the domains of the most powerful diadochi lay to the west. Unlike Alexander, he did not attempt to push further into India. Instead, he forged an alliance with the Indian king Chandragupta. In exchange for ceding some eastern territories, Seleucus received 500 war elephants. Later allied with Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, Seleucus waged war against Antigonus the One-Eyed, first defeating the army of his son Demetrius, and then Antigonus himself at the Battle of Ipsus. It was there that the elephants proved decisive in securing victory. Incidentally, a fondness for these animals was a hallmark of the Seleucid dynasty. They were frequently depicted on royal coinage, and elephants that distinguished themselves in battle were even awarded decorations. After the death of Antigonus, the alliance of the four diadochi fell apart, and Seleucus first waged war against Lysimachus, defeating him completely, and then set out to bring Macedonia under his control as well. Had he succeeded, the entire empire of Alexander, except for Egypt, would once again have been united. But before he could reach Macedonia, Seleucus was killed by the son of his former ally, Ptolemy Soter. By the time of his death, King Seleucus I Nicator, meaning victor, was already over 80. In him, most of Alexander's empire found a worthy successor. He was a strong and astute ruler, skilled both in warfare and diplomacy. Like Alexander, Seleucus treated the conquered peoples of Asia with respect. For instance, he was the only one of the diadochi who did not divorce his Asian wife after Alexander's death. As a result, his heir, Antiochus I, was not entirely alien to the eastern lands of the empire. Following in the footsteps of his illustrious predecessor, Seleucus founded numerous cities throughout his vast kingdom. The most renowned among them were two of antiquity's most important cities, Antioch on the Orontes and Seleucia on the Tigris. Another significant achievement of the dynasty's founder was granting satrapies and cities a degree of self-governance modeled on the Greek polis. By establishing Macedonian-style cities while refraining from suppressing local cultures, Seleucus played a major role in the Hellenization of Asia and the peaceful coexistence of two distinct worlds. Seleucus left behind a sole heir, whom he had made his co-ruler during his lifetime. The conditions for transferring power were ideal. There was no possibility of civil strife. And yet, even under such optimal circumstances for consolidating Seleucid power, during the reigns of the next four rulers, their empire began to visibly wither away. Many Seleucid kings waged wars against their historic enemy, the Ptolemaic Egypt. These conflicts, known as the Syrian Wars, numbered as many as 6. They were fought with mixed success and centered on disputes over Phoenicia and Judea, draining the royal treasury significantly. In addition, the Seleucids were engaged in constant warfare in Asia Minor. A serious adversary there was the kingdom of Pergamon, which emerged after the death of Lysimachus. It was in battle against Pergamon that Antiochus I was killed. Perpetually embroiled in wars on the western front of their empire, the Seleucids were unable to maintain effective control over the east. Already during the reign of Antiochus II, Bactria and Parthia broke away from the empire. The Parthian state, led by Central Asian nomads, would later become one of the Seleucids' principal enemies. Soon internal strife erupted within the Seleucid kingdom itself. As a result of conspiracies, both Antiochus II and Seleucus II were killed. By the year 223 BC, when Antiochus III ascended the throne, the Seleucid Empire had lost a significant portion of its territories in both the east and the west. Under Antiochus III, known as the Great, the Seleucid Empire experienced a brief period of revival, although, to anticipate the outcome, it never managed to restore its former borders. First and foremost, Antiochus suppressed the rebellion of the satraps of Media and Persia, who had seized all of Mesopotamia. Then, in an attempt to reclaim Judea, he suffered a defeat at the hands of Egypt in the large-scale Battle of Raphia. However, he succeeded in recapturing the lands east of the Taurus Mountains, which had previously been taken by Pergamon. Subsequently, Antiochus also brought the entire southern coast of Asia Minor under his control. In the year 212 BC, the Seleucid king launched his most successful eastern campaign, which lasted 7 years. During this expedition, Antiochus reached as far as Bactria, capturing along the way the Parthian capital of Hecatompylos. Some eastern territories returned to Seleucid rule, while others, including Parthia, acknowledged Antiochus as their suzerain. A new treaty was also concluded with an Indian king. Upon returning from the eastern campaign, Antiochus initiated another war against Egypt. He decided to seize the opportunity presented by a power struggle that had broken out among the Ptolemies. Following this Fifth Syrian War, Judea was ultimately restored to Seleucid control. As if driven by the spirit of his illustrious forebear, Antiochus, like Seleucus before him, after a series of impressive successes in Asia, decided to cross the strait and march his troops into Greece. But by then, it had already become part of Rome's sphere of influence. The Second Punic War had ended in a Roman victory, enabling them to redirect their main forces against Macedonia. Incidentally, after Carthage's defeat, Hannibal went to Antiochus and for a time served as an advisor at his court. Perhaps without Roman interference, Antiochus might have managed to subdue Macedonia. But the Romans could not allow that and, as always, were determined to defend any territory they claimed for themselves. When negotiations proved fruitless, a battle ensued at the famed pass of Thermopylae, where Antiochus suffered a defeat. The conflict then shifted to Asia Minor, culminating in the decisive Battle of Magnesia. This engagement featured the largest army in the history of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus managed to mobilize 72,000 men. The Romans, with forces nearly half that size, nonetheless emerged victorious. The main problem with the Seleucid army was that it consisted of a vast array of ethnic groups drawn from all corners of the enormous empire. As in Alexander's time, the core of the army was made up of the phalanx and the cavalry guard, but together they accounted for less than 1/3 of the total force. The remaining tens of thousands of soldiers formed scattered detachments, typically lightly armed and not particularly steadfast. On top of that, they spoke different languages. The Seleucid army even employed special interpreters, but in battle the language barrier still posed a major issue. By contrast, the Roman army was a true monolith. So despite its numerical superiority, Antiochus lost more than half his army and was forced to agree to an extremely unfavorable peace treaty. The Romans compelled him to surrender all territory in Asia Minor up to the Taurus Mountains, which, incidentally, they did not immediately annex but instead handed over to their allies, Pergamon and Rhodes. Additionally, the Seleucids were required to pay an enormous indemnity within a very short time frame, 15,000 talents of silver over 12 years. For comparison, after the Second Punic War, Carthage had to pay 10,000 over 50 years. In his search for funds, Antiochus resorted to desperate measures. In 187 BCE, he plundered a sacred temple in Elymai with a small detachment. Outraged locals caught up with the group and killed them all, including the great king himself. One could say that the decline of the Seleucid Empire began immediately after the death of its founder, but the final chance to retain its former might was lost under Antiochus the Great. Following his defeat in the war against the Romans, the entire foreign policy of the Seleucids became directly dependent on Rome. During the Sixth and final Syrian War, Antiochus IV finally succeeded in subduing Egypt and nearly conquered it in full. However, the Romans, determined to prevent the Seleucid state from gaining strength, issued the king an ultimatum demanding the abandonment of all conquered territories. Antiochus IV acquiesced and withdrew from Egypt. Thus, despite its vast remoteness and lack of territory in Asia, it was now Rome that held sway over the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, though it retained nominal independence, had in effect become a Roman protectorate. The Seleucid Empire once again descended into civil war. From Antiochus the Great to the very end of the dynasty, not a single one of the more than 20 kings died a natural death, and the empire's territory continued to shrink at a rapid pace. In defiance of the forced Hellenization and religious persecution imposed by Antiochus IV, the Jews rose up against royal authority, a revolt that ultimately led to Judea's independence. Incidentally, it was in commemoration of the Seleucids' expulsion and the restoration of religious worship that the tradition of celebrating Hanukkah began. Meanwhile, in the east, the Parthians were launching a broad campaign of expansion. By 139 BC, they had seized Mesopotamia and captured King Demetrius II. However, the Parthians chose to spare his life. At that time, the Seleucid Empire was experiencing a division of power. Another king ruled in Antioch, and keeping Demetrius alive served the Parthians' interest by perpetuating the internal split. To grasp the extent to which the Seleucid Empire was mired in intrigue and conspiracy, one need only follow the life story of Cleopatra Thea, the only queen of the Seleucid dynasty. The daughter of the Egyptian king Ptolemy VI, she was married off to Alexander Ballas, a pretender to the throne who had overthrown King Demetrius I to become ruler of the Seleucids. When Demetrius II, the son of the slain king, returned from exile, Ptolemy and Cleopatra Thea lent him their support. Alexander Ballas was defeated and killed, and Cleopatra became the wife of the new ruler, Demetrius II. When Demetrius was captured by the Parthians, his brother Antiochus VII ascended the throne and likewise married Cleopatra Thea. Antiochus later perished during a campaign against Parthia. Demetrius II returned from captivity, and Cleopatra once again became his wife. Not long after, Demetrius died fighting against a new usurper, Alexander II. The legitimate heir to the throne was Seleucus V, the eldest son of Demetrius and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra murdered him in order to rule in her own right. Her formal claim to power lay in her regency for the underage Antiochus VIII. When Antiochus came of age and assumed full kingship, he crushed the usurper Alexander II and sought to diminish his mother's influence over his rule. Cleopatra attempted to poison him, but Antiochus saw through the plot and forced her to drink the very wine she had offered him. Sometime later, a new contender emerged, Antiochus IX, the son of Cleopatra, and Antiochus VII, who launched a civil war against the VIII. At the beginning of the 1st century BC, the Seleucid Empire had been reduced to just Syria and Cilicia. By that time, in addition to Rome and Parthia, the Seleucids had gained another powerful neighbor, Armenia. During a campaign against Parthia, King Tigranes the Great brought vast territories under his control, including Mesopotamia. Then in 83 BC, he invaded Syria and, encountering no resistance, occupied the capital, Antioch. There, Tigranes was crowned king of Syria, but in 68 BC, the Romans drove him out, briefly restoring the Seleucid throne, only to abolish it entirely 4 years later. Syria then became a Roman province for many centuries to come. Yet even during those 4 years, when the Seleucid Empire nominally continued to exist, its last two kings managed to quarrel with each other. This in a way encapsulates the entire history of the once great state founded by Seleucus I. The territories that fell into Macedonian hands were too vast, too diverse, and too alien. The empire's eventual collapse was inevitable. What's more, the endless internal strife likely caused it greater harm than even the mightiest of its external foes.